Welcome to the College of Knowledge. This time, innovation and disruption in developing economies. A prominent businessman with diverse investments in hospitality, tourism, franchising, ICT and renewable energy. Here is Dr. Shingi Munyeza.
Thank you and good evening. I'm going to talk about Africa and whether Africa is blessed or cursed. I think I've been walking that journey for a while, and having traversed Africa in my journey in terms of business, I have realized that there are certain things that have caused me to think. They are the ghosts, what I call the ghosts from the past. Africa has had the good times, the bad times, and the ugly times. Well, some of the ghosts from the past have really shortchanged Africa in terms of that. Number one, we're coming from a colonial past, where most of our colonizers, if not all of our colonizers, trained us to be managers, because they saw us as a resource to manage their businesses, to manage their assets, to manage their own portfolios, or just to be workers for them. The second one was tribalism, where we were all siloed into our different tribal groupings, and therefore there was no real interaction, there was no devolution, there's been no development, there have been more wars, no innovation. You find a lot of that our tribal wars still persist up until now. Our politics are put around our tribal lines. And then we have the liberators from colonialism, and then we have the liberators that came on. But these also brought something that was unfathomable by all means, which is sustained corruption, abuse of national resources, and we found ourselves with them being entitled to these things. So they are still, we kind of moved back to where we would have been in the colonial era. Then we move on to what I call generationalism. The generationalism is the resistance to renewal, where the older people are still feeling that they are entitled, they must be there for a little longer than they should be, and our young people don't have that sort of luxury or have the same experiences and same testimonies that we talk about. I talk about to a lot of young people today, and guess what they normally say? You keep telling us about in the 80s, in the 90s, in the what? This is what we used to do. We could walk through, financial services houses and be able to get a mortgage, be able to get a loan. We can't do that today. So there are certain things that they can't identify to. I remember some years back after my daughter was in high school, and we used to go down to South Africa, all over the world. There was always some coins. So in the era that she grew up to be a teenager, she had never seen a coin in Zimbabwe. So when we used to talk about dollars and cents and so on, you remember those days of bearer notes and so on. So there's some things that our young people have lost, and therefore they feel excluded from the economic life of most of Africa's economies. And it's still dominated by the Madalas or the older people like myself, and even much older. The 30s, or rather the 40s and below, and some of them I can see them here and nodding their heads and saying, look, I think you're right there. You're talking about us. Well, the other one is the misogynistic behavior because of our culture, where our culture has a tendency to be anti-women or prejudicial towards women. Yet they carry the burden of society. So you look at those sort of things, you say, look, how are we going to develop entrepreneurship? How are we going to develop our economy? Yet when you look at Zimbabwe being the breadbasket of Africa, did you know that much of its agriculture was at the back of women out there who have now grown old? And therefore, our agricultural output right now is lower, particularly on the cereals, because you know why? It's because the women who used to produce that grain have grown a little older, and they cannot do as much work as they used to be doing then. You go down in the rural areas right now, there are no young girls who are plowing. It's older women. So we've got to check that and deal with that as we go. All right, so I'm answering the question, is Africa cursed or blessed? And we are resource rich. IMF classifies 51 countries globally as resource-rich. These are countries which derive at least 20% of their exports or 20% of the fiscal revenue from non-renewable natural resources. 29 of these countries, let me say this, are low and lower middle income earners, and the majority being African. Common characteristics of these countries include extreme dependence on resource wealth for fiscal revenues, export sales or both, low savings rate, poor growth performance, highly volatile resources, resources and revenues. This is typical. When I look at my country, Zimbabwe, right now, we are endowed with whatever natural resource you can think of in terms of minerals. But look at where our economy is. What is the problem? And the problem is that when you look at your GDP growth and you look at the resource that you have in a country, most of the countries that are resource-rich have some of the lowest or even negative GDP growth figures. You look at that graph there, it tells you that most of the countries that are doing extremely well in terms of GDP growth have very little resources, natural resources. And the countries you see going further on that horizontal axis, those are African countries. And look at their GDP growth. Well, it may be reasonable to believe that as many countries that can export natural resources have a weak protection of property rights, much corruption, and poor quality public bureaucracy. Right now, we have a problem of property rights in the same resource-rich countries. And I'm getting to there that, so what must be done? How can we be blessed? And in terms of our blessing, we've got to start looking at the savings nature or the ability to drive the economies through a particular style of leadership. Research was done by Aslaksen in 2008 of the whole aspect of presidentialism and parliamentarism. Now, Africa leans much on presidentialism, which means that the president, whatever he says, goes. And therefore, this style of leadership affects the institutions or the strengths of the institutions of governance. Parliamentarism favors strengthening of institutions of governance. And therefore, we find that people begin to either have partisan behavior towards the natural resources because the president says so, because the ruling elite says so. And now there is no rule of law, there is no constitutionality, there is no behavior in terms of constitutionalism. So institutions become very weak, and also the types of resources is also important to understand. Now, when a country is being given oil and diamonds, it is a double dose of a curse, because all those have tended to attract wars, have tended to attract the worst amongst its own nationals, and therefore it doesn't get the benefit. I mean, we had the same experience. We should have got some of the best entrepreneurs in Zimbabwe, which we have, by the way, across the globe, to come and help us deal with our diamonds in Maranga. We didn't do that. To come and deal with our gold that we have. Our platinum, there's been a good progress on platinum. But it is because of the type of resources that you have. Now imagine the day we will discover oil in Zimbabwe. If we don't have a correct approach to this, we will almost say, I wish there was no oil that we found. But there's gas out there. There's also a debate that has gone on over the years, which was a research was done, where did we get an early or late industrialization? Most of Africa got a late industrialization. So when industrialization moved on, guess what happened? We were left behind, and we are still trying to catch up with industrialization. That's why when you go to an African economy, all we are still trying to do is to do the things that were done 70, 80 years ago in the rest of Europe or the rest of the world. So we are trying to do a catch-up. And I don't think that there is any need to do a catch-up. this is where we need to bring in disruption, and this is where we need to bring in innovation, and this is where we need to start. And one country that that escaped the resource curse is Botswana, actually. It is because diamonds were discovered after it got independent, and that the colonizers didn't have the joy of trying to manage that resource on behalf of the people that were there. And guess what? It got good leadership as well. So where's the wealth of the nations? And this is where I'd like to just zero in on. Where's the wealth of the nations at the moment? When you look at that graph there, you find that the low-income countries have much of their wealth in manufacturing, in the natural resources, and in what they call intangible. This is a World Bank research. And then the middle income, you see how it goes. And then the high income earners in the globe is that 80% of their wealth is actually in intangible. So you look at a country like the United States of America, and you look at a company like Apple, and soon it will have a market cap of $1 trillion, and that's one company in a country. And you find where their wealth is. Now, we look at the same thing that has happened in Zimbabwe, and I think that we need to learn a few things here. You look at the market cap of Econet. 20 years later, since it was formed, or back then, look at its market cap. What has been it? It is because of the intangibility of where the economies are going, disruption is going, and yet we keep looking at our finite resources to move us forward. We need to leverage on the disruption in ICT and technology in order to get back and get our diamonds, our platinum, and so on and so forth. But what we are doing is we still want to use pick and shovel to get the diamonds out of the ground, or the gold out of the ground. And yet the rest of the world is looking at how do you make yourself a high-income earner. High-income earners are depending on disruption that is going on. Entrepreneurship is one, harnessing the informal sector. For example, I'm looking at what should we do about two aspects. Number one, the informal sector. This is a gold mine. We need to harness the informal sector, not just in Zimbabwe, but in the whole of Africa. You travel around Africa, you see the informal sector, how it is. It can look like it's a curse, but let me tell you, it's a blessing. Because this is where you can bring in innovation without too much complexity around it. The other aspect you look at is that we all complained in Zimbabwe about the issue of not having cash, and that we are queuing up for cash. Well, I've gone deeper into this. I was one of those criticizing where we are, but I've then changed my mind. I said, look, this thing is going one way. Now, we have fast-forwarded ourselves as a country to be, in terms of plastic money and the use of electronic banking. And then we have fast-forwarded ourselves in there. Now, we're never going to change our habits to go and queue at a bank to get cash anymore. So guess what? I'm working with financial institutions right now. In the next few months, we will be launching technology-driven ICT disruption, because there is no country in Africa which has now become the way we are in terms of ICT and in terms of banking, mobile wallet, and EFTs that are going on. And we are not going backwards there. I know people are still clamoring out there, say, look, we still want to find cash in banks. That behavior that we've now got, we are not going back there. So we must look at that innovation. We must look at telephony and fintech and work ourselves backwards so that we bring ourselves out of the curse into the blessing. Disruption is the only thing that will leapfrog us to the fourth industrial revolution through services. And if we are going to be rich, if we're going to have young people benefit, the young people who have gone abroad come back, they are trained that way. Let's use that skill today. And let's work on where exactly we are so that we turn the curse into a blessing.